After a lovely and informative trip to the Cape George Boatyard in last week's episode, we are now ready to tackle the decks. Join us as we prepare and explain what we're doing and why on earth we're doing it.
Moisture, 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 rot, moisture, rot, 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 moisture, delamination.
Alright, so yes, welcome back to the boatyard. And as you can see, we've got a few more projects going on, all of them sort of in preparation for the big decks project, which we've been talking about the past few episodes. And in the last episode, we visited the actual Cape George yard where our boat was built to get some advice about that. So now we're kind of doing some prep work that we have to do before we start opening the decks. Do you want to describe a little bit of what that is?
I just took off the rub rail yesterday and they're laying right here on the table. And basically they're coming off because they are through bolted through the blocking. Many of the blockings will have to be replaced. So we removed all the through bolts and then of course the rub rail is not supported anymore, so it comes off as well. And even if it wasn't for blocking, when you do an extensive refit like this, I would ideally take it off anyway. If it is through bolted, it is very good to reseal everything. Trusted scrapers. I really love these. So they have different attachments, and as you can see, the surface on the sides is flat, but then they have sawed out concave surface on the inside, and that is for better contour to the hole. And for that I have this little scraper that comes with different blades, and now I have attached a pear blade to it, and so it's really nice to carve this out, so to speak, following the shape that it has, the concave shape.
One of our primary goals also for removing some of this furniture, at least temporarily, is that we have a insulated hull. Now, to be perfectly honest, we actually thought that this boat was insulated with foam. It turns out we were wrong, and I mean, there's plenty of ways we could have found this out. I don't know why we just didn't. It's actually insulated with balsa. Now, this is not a terrible thing. First of all, it's not cord, and I think that's a difference because you have boats that have a balsa cord hull, and that's when the balsa is stuck in between two thin layers of fiberglass, and the balsa itself is actually a structural component of the boat, and if it gets wet, then the whole integrity of your hull is compromised, and then there's big problems. In our case, we have a, 1-inch solid fiberglass hull, and as an additional layer, when you bought the boat, you could apparently pay $1,300 to get it upgraded to an insulated hull. So they make the hull same as normal, then they put on some balsa, and then they cover it with a thin layer of fiberglass, just for insulative purposes. So even if all this balsa was completely rotten, the boat would be heavier, but it wouldn't be structurally compromised. Now the problem here is that you do want to make sure that the balsa is not going to get rotten still. And you have to do that by sealing it properly. And there's just all over instances where the balsa is not sealed properly. There's screw holes going into it everywhere. That's more of a minor problem. But there's also places like right here where something had to fit here, so they just like cut away, like I don't even know what was going on here. They cut away the fiberglass. It looks like they put foam in here actually.
That's balsa.
That's balsa?
Yeah.
It's so soft.
Well, I think that got banged.
I don't know what happened here. There's just a lot of places where balsa is exposed. Like up here, there was a bolt coming through the deck, so they just cut it away, and now here's the balsa right there, ready for moisture to pour in. So that's also something that we want to do is try as much as we can to seal up this balsa.
So after we remove the rub rail, the bolts which hold the rub rail go through the blocking, as you can see in this hole here. So they're clamped like that. And normally the blocking shouldn't pop up, but this is one that has been replaced, and it is pushed in there because it is not to very accurate dimensions. But also I'm very surprised to see that there is no glue whatsoever. And anyhow, this really doesn't matter now. It's good that this came off, so we could actually see 1, 2, 3, 4 of the beams. Because after talking to Todd, our conclusion was more, let's hope for the best. They're not too far gone from what we could see before taking the blocking out. So, to be honest with you guys, when we discussed this at the yard, it sounded pretty good to me. Like, oh, the deck beams are not too far gone, just leave them and do the rest. It sounds pretty okay, right? We get to finish quicker and there's less to do, and why not skip the very ugly parts or difficult parts. Yeah, it is difficult now that I actually see some of them to just ignore my pride in doing something new. I had similar troubles with Magic Carpet. I didn't have a lot of money to buy materials, so I was recycling parts of the boat. Like, I cut a bulkhead out and that was plywood I could use somewhere else. Even though I am pretty proud of what it looks like now. So of course these two were an exception because they were not bedded nor perfectly shaped to fit the gap, but they were a bit loose, so I was able to get them out. But we are still proceeding in opening up the side decks to get access to all the blocking from above.
One of the questions we've been asked several times is, why not do all these repairs from below deck so that we don't have to cut the decks open? For example, we could replace the blocking by sliding new pieces into place between the beams, and for the beams themselves, we could either sister new beams to bad beams, or cut off the bad section of a beam and scarf in a new section, all without removing the decks. These are totally valid repair methods and would work just fine in most situations. But ultimately, we've decided we'd actually rather open the decks to make these repairs, which I know will probably sound a bit strange, so I should definitely explain. Okay, so here's my really poorly drawn diagram of our deck construction from above. Each beam sits on the beam shelf at one end and fits into the carlin, which is a large beam underneath the cabin top on the other end. All of the rot is located on the beam shelf side. The beams are fastened to the beam shelf with 2 large bronze carriage bolts, and in between the beams are the blocking. The blocking is held in place by 2 screws from above, which angle sideways into the ends of the deck beams. The blocking also has a bolt through the middle, which actually holds the rub rail onto the exterior of the hull. The purpose of the blocking is to prevent flexing and movement of the deck and the beams. The blocking also supports the bulwarks, which are built directly above them. And of course, don't forget that even though it's not shown in this picture, there is a layer of plywood and fiberglass over top all of this. So to replace the blocking from inside the boat, we would first need to cut the screws which hold each piece in place. This cut could be achieved with an oscillating multi-tool and a carbide blade, and once cut, we could then pry the old blocking out. We probably would have to destroy most of the blocking to get it out because you can't just slide it out towards you. The beam shelf isn't perfectly faired and not perfectly level, and the beams are not perfectly parallel, which means that the very accurately sized original blocking can't actually slide past them. And this may not be a problem since a lot of the blocking is rotten enough to come out in pieces anyway. But once the blocking is removed, we would have to make new blocking. The only problem is that the beam shelf still isn't perfectly faired or level, and the beams are still not perfectly parallel, so our blocking will probably have to have some gaps around the edge in order to slide in. Just like those blockings you just saw Aladino remove, they kind of just slid out and they had a few gaps around the edges. So we'd have to fill in those gaps with some glue or caulking to close them. And now the next challenge would be to fasten the blocking. We can't really use screws from above like original unless we want to put a screw through the entire plywood decks, which isn't ideal. So we could just rely on glue and on that one bolt in the middle that goes through the hull to hold the rub rail in place. Although this method saves us from opening a section of the deck, it does mean that we're doing a lot of uncomfortable overhead work in very cramped conditions, which is definitely unpleasant. And the finished results are good, but they're not ideal because you do have that gap around the blocking. And the blocking is a visible component of the interior of the boat, and as you know, we are suckers for beauty. The other method that ultimately we've decided upon is to open up the outer 6 inches or so of the deck to get access to the blocking from above. We would use a router to make the cut, remove the plywood, and then easily unscrew all the blocking. We could then replace the rotten blocking very accurately by sliding in new pieces from above and fastening them from above as well. The extra work of removing a section of the decks is paid for by not having to do the uncomfortable overhead work, and also by getting more accurate finished results. Plus, the plywood decks have been replaced in several areas, so should be okay, but there are a few sections where we anticipate the decks themselves will also be rotten. Todd from Cape George Marine Works also emphasized that this is how he would do it, and since he is the Cape George master, we've decided to follow his advice and go this route. As for the deck beams, we haven't yet decided if we are actually going to replace any deck beams or if we're going to be content with filling rotten sections with epoxy. It all depends on how extensive we find the rot to be. If we do have to repair beams, we think we would rather work out a method to replace the whole beam instead of sistering or joining. Sistering still means we would have to make a new beam, and meanwhile the rotten beam is still there, and we are adding extra weight to the decks, which isn't really where you want extra weight. Scarfing a new section of the beam in means that we would have to remove half the beam, make half the beam, and make a scarf joint overhead, which is a very labor-intense process that leaves us thinking it would probably be easier to just replace the whole thing and get it over with. But that decision still depends on just how extensive the rot is once we really start digging into it. Unfortunately, from past experience, we do know that rot is often like an iceberg. The visible part is just the beginning. So I hope this explanation made sense and that our reasoning behind all this is a bit clearer. Ultimately, there are many ways to skin a cat, and you've just got to decide what works best for you, what compromises you're willing to make, and how far you're willing to go. This is what we have decided works for us at the moment.
So logically, the next question that arose and that I was thinking about the past few days is how to go about opening the side decks. It's easy to make a cut, but there's different ways of doing so, and I was just trying to figure out which one is best. I think I can best illustrate my two options with a drawing. So here I've drawn the two options, and basically this line here should describe the cut in the plywood. And as you can see, option 1 would be to do a parallel cut parallel to the hull. So these two lines, of course, are parallel. And option 2 instead is cuts parallel to the center line. And I was thinking that with option 2, I could use a sheet of plywood better, and instead here you have two curvatures, and so probably you have more waste in plywood. But yeah, sometimes I just break my head over things which maybe don't make a big difference anyway. A few sheets of plywood more or less. Of course, this one here is just drawn as one piece of plywood now, but they would have exactly the same length. The sheets of plywood that you can get. So let's draw these cuts in as well. And this is of course not on any kind of scale. And one very important part is that every cut 90 degree to the center line, so these here, they would be exactly on the beams. So let me draw it in, and here is the beam. So of course I've not measured any of this or have a drawing to actually be able to play Lego and plan the cuts and the piece of plywood with an actual drawing of the boat, but I'm just illustrating it to explain some of the things to you guys. These cuts, which are longitudinally, you do want to stagger the plywood. Ideally, you would want to do a scarf. A scarf needs to be 8 to 12 times the thickness of the plywood. So if it was 1 inch thick, you would have to do a scarf 12 inches. But that is really difficult when one piece of the puzzle is installed, screwed and glued on the boat, and the other sheet of plywood is on your workbench. So another way of doing this is actually staggering the layers of plywood. And then basically you're creating a sandwich, or so to speak, a new panel of plywood that is fully glued. Another thing that is often done is by using blocking from the inside. We might think of these details further along the way, but for now, let's stick to the staggering and more the simple difficulties. So let's say that our initial cut that goes through the entire thickness of the plywood will be done at the minimum distance, so to speak. We're trying to stay close to the hull for now, but we want to gain enough access to work on the rotten part of the beam and the blocking. So let's say we make it here and it goes through the entire thickness. And now when we are about to reassemble, I was talking about the scarf, which would be ideal here, which is very difficult to achieve. So what are we going to do is probably staggering. This is getting confusing, so let's make it bigger actually.
Yeah.
So let's call this the first cut, which goes through the entire thickness. So ideally we would stagger more than one, but let's say we're just going to do one, because that's what we might actually stick to. So this is what it would look like. And then the first insert that we put in is half the thickness of the plywood and is inserted to the first cut, which is this piece here. The only confusing part is that this line is shown now, but the second layer is one piece that goes over it, and that's what gives it a lot of strength. And now the weak point is only here. It could be addressed with some blocking from underneath, but For now, don't think that's necessary. We might get in some hints from other people if it's necessary, can still be done. But there is also fiberglass covering the whole thing on top, and it is 1 inch thick. It's good to think about those things, but I think it will be all right. But staggering is very important for sure. Don't make a cut and just do butt ends together.
Yeah.
But the question is how to open it up. We'll think about that one still for a bit and see what we come up to.
I can't see you anymore, Schatzi.
Hey?
I can't see you anymore.
Good.
You're hidden.
Sorry?
You're hidden.
Yes, I'm trying to put up a little bit of a mess preventing system.
Mess prevention. Sounds good.
No, it doesn't reach further. We have decided. The curved cut now is the choice because it seems to be much easier to do so. Instead of measuring and really seeing, are we parallel to center line and where are the beams from here where they're not visible, so you gotta go below and transfer it up here. It's more complicated. And instead, the curved cut, we can just make a jig for the router that keeps us at the same distance and just run from stern to bow. So that's what I've prepared. There is many different solutions and I just played with what I had here right now. Luckily I had these bolts that I could modify. They're just about like 4 inches, and with extending a bit with this wooden structure, I have 6 inches now. And that is just a random figure. I thought it's luxurious enough to work, but it's a fairly small gap. So the idea is to running the router along our hull. But this is still a very jagged surface. There's this little lip here that was from the previous bulwarks. So even though I dread it, I think I'll jump into the Tyvek suit and I'll take the angle grinder and see if I can get this a little smoother first. I know it's not a thing of beauty, it's a bit jagged, but that's alright. Otherwise we would have to prep this surface nicely so that it runs along parallel. But that's alright, this is the first cut of maybe 3, because you should not go down the entire depth right away. Especially with a small router, which is less powerful. So I'm gonna set it a bit deeper now, and I'm gonna do the second pass. Time to empty the Festool diaper.
Oh my god.
If you're wondering how to tell when they're full, well, you can pretty much tell from the sound. Yeah, that's I love that little vacuum, and I bought it because I find it super handy to have this small one even when we're cruising. Whenever we have shore power, it is so nice to have this little vacuum. It is so powerful that you can do projects with it. The only thing is that right now it is the one with the smallest volume, so either it gets a bit expensive with bags, and that is why I empty this one out when I'm just doing wood and not too nasty materials. Otherwise I would just throw it away. This is quite the surgery. It took so many passes. I was taking a bit too much at a time. That's when it started smoking. Doing really like just 1/8 of an inch at the time. Then it works really nice. It's just that it takes freaking long because you're doing so many passes. So we are through. We can see the deck beams. And also, of course, you don't want to get into the deck beams, so you go really step by step and you measure here and there. The plywood is 1 inch thick. I mean, we knew this before, but this is again another thing that I cannot quite wrap my head around. It's quite a bit to me. Ta-da!
Nice.
Moisture, 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 rot, moisture, rot, 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 moisture, delamination. Oh, look at the little moldies.
Oh yeah, little molds.
You see the moldies?
Well, I guess this is actually quite a satisfying part, hey? Since we're doing this anyway, it's kind of nice to know that it's super necessary.
Let's redo it all then.
So what's the next step now? Now you have to get the plywood up somehow.
Yeah. Change of plans. So before tackling the side decks and opening them, I want to get rid of fiberglass now. So I went ahead, I routed out a seam entirely along the cabin top, and fiberglass won't peel off as easy because it's still attached on one side, but I'm gonna give it a go.
All right. Because replacing the fiberglass over the whole boat is something we wanted to do anyway.
Yeah.
If you remember from our survey episode right at the beginning, there's actually quite a bit of delamination all along the cabin top here. So.
And that's one of the things that I truly am confident with and have lots of practice. So that's really no biggie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. You want to rip up some fiberglass?
Oh yes.
Oh yes. Do you?
Well, I just don't want fiberglass anymore.
Yay.
Let me tell you a little secret.
Oh.
It is actually pleasurable is maybe too much, but it is actually nice to work with fiberglass. The hideous part is getting rid of fiberglass.
Yeah.
The dismantling, the sanding, the osmosis treatment where you have to use the planer. Yeah, well, this is similar, sort of, so already got fiberglass all over. This is the not fun fiberglass part.
Yay.
Yay. it's interesting to see that there is one mat and a woven fabric over top. It looks to be very thin, 6 to 8 ounces. We will do more, definitely. Even here where it looks pretty sound, it just peels off. Maybe they didn't wet out the decks before glassing. Just like that, the fiberglass is off. It took half a day. We did incredibly much today. I started off with the router. We opened up one section and then I was like, no, this is silly. Let's get rid of the fiberglass. I routed around the entire cabin top. And now we've peeled away the whole layer of fiberglass on the decks. So I'm sure I'll sleep till 12 tomorrow. All right, that's it for today.
And it's time for me to do my end of episode wrap up now. Thank you so much for watching. This was a fun one to film because it was a big transformation, a very visible transformation. The boat looks very different now. Thanks patrons for making these episodes possible, and an extra big thanks to the folks whose names are now appearing on screen, for they got to go above and beyond to make sure that Magic Carpet keeps being produced, which we are so happy about. We feel like the luckiest folks on earth to be able to do all this and share our story with you, and it's all just going so well. So thanks for being a part of it. We'll see you all next Friday.